Welcome to China in Context. I'm Duncan Bartlett. The president of the Philippines says that when China used water cannons to fire on boats from his country in the spring of 2024, it was a highly dangerous move, which could have sparked a major conflict. China insists the incident was entirely caused by the Philippines' provocation. It says its response was reasonable, legal, and professional. The United States has made it clear which side it's on. The American military has stepped up joint exercises with the Philippines Navy and Coast Guard. But even with superpower backing, how can a poorly resourced country, such as the Philippines, stand up to China's might? And what does the situation around the islands reveal about China's wider territorial ambitions? Well, our guest on the podcast today is an expert on the region. Nicola Smith is Asia correspondent for the Daily Telegraph newspaper, and she joins me on the line from Seoul in South Korea. Nicola, welcome to China in Context.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, your newspaper has suggested that the People's Republic of China is undertaking a slow-motion invasion of the entire South China Sea. Can you explain the significance of that phrase, please?
Well, that phrase came from a regular commentator to the Telegraph. Invasion's not a word I would personally use, but what I would say is that we have seen a very significant escalation of China's expansionist ambitions in the South China Sea. And certainly over the last year, at least, we have seen more aggressive actions by the Chinese Coast Guard in particular to assert Beijing's claims over disputed waters, shoals, reefs, and islands in the South China Sea. And tensions have risen very specifically between China and the Philippines, where President Marcos has taken a much more assertive position in challenging China's claims over maritime features that are located within the Philippines' 200-mile exclusive economic zone. And just to take a step back and give a bit of wider context here, China claims almost all of the South China Sea. So this vast 1.3 million square miles of resource-rich waters through which trillions of pounds of international trade travels every year. And it makes these claims even though it has no international legal basis to do so. And if you look at how it asserts these claims, it's not using lethal or even military force to do so, but what we would call grey zone tactics by the Chinese Coast Guard, by the maritime militia, sometimes by the Navy. So they flood certain areas of the seas with their presence. They are intimidating, bullying other Coast Guard ships from different nations or fishing vessels. They're blocking their paths. They're turning water cannons on them. And China is also beefing up its patchwork of military outposts and artificial islands with where it's placing runways, ports, military equipment. And it's doing all of this to squeeze out not only the Philippines, but other rival claimants like Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan.
Well, these are dramatic developments. You visited the region. What did you observe?
It has been a dramatic year, although I would say that historically, over the past few years, this is not a sudden problem. This has been a creeping situation. But in April, I was one of a small group of international and Filipino journalists to be granted rare access to a Philippine Coast Guard ship and on a mission where they were accompanying a supply boat that was taking fuel and food out to the Scarborough Shoal. And the Scarborough Shoal is a chain of reefs and rocks covering about roughly 58 square miles. It was administered by the Philippines until 2012, when China effectively seized it. And since then, China has blocked access to very valuable fishing waters. They have blocked access to Philippine fishing boats. And Filipino fishermen are complaining of a loss of income. So this mission was to take supplies out to them in nearby waters. And this is all within, again, the Philippines' 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So we set off from Manila. We sailed overnight. By 5 a.m., we started to see the first Chinese Coast Guard vessels on the horizon, and they got gradually closer. It was clearly some kind of intimidation tactic. And by the time we got to 24 nautical miles of the shoal, it took quite an aggressive turn. We found ourselves in a high-speed chase. And as our crew were examining what was happening, two Chinese Coast Guards came up from either side and then opened fire with water cannons. These were high-powered water cannons. The water cannons were so powerful that they actually bent in half an iron railing on the ship. They collapsed an awning and its metal framework. And really, if that had hit a human being, it could have been very dangerous.
Now, tell us about the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Well, he certainly has a more assertive foreign policy when it comes to China, which is a major contrast with the previous president, Duterte, who had a much cozier relationship with Beijing. This fits more with current public opinion and domestic concerns about Chinese influence in the Philippines. Previous President Duterte had a serious rift with Washington over his criticism of his draconian war on drugs, and where thousands of people died, many of them in arbitrary killings. And he threatened during his presidency to end the Visiting Forces Agreement, which gives legal protection to US military who are based in the Philippines. And so in contrast to that, President Marcos has allowed US forces more access to 4 additional military bases. And this really strengthens this arc of alliances in the Indo-Pacific.
Now, there's been an attempt to resolve these matters through the international courts. A ruling has suggested that China's territorial claim on the South China Sea, including the region around the Philippines, actually, doesn't have any legitimate legal basis. Has that international court decision made any difference, in your opinion?
The short answer is that it appears to be no, it hasn't made any difference. What happened was that after China effectively seized the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, the Philippines went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague to challenge China's claims to much of the South China Sea. And in 2016, the court ruled in the Philippines' favor and rejected China's historical assertions. But China just refused point blank to acknowledge this ruling, and it has ignored it ever since. And this should surely be cause for alarm among the international community if it's ignoring the decisions of well-established international bodies and just doing its own thing.
Well, let's consider what this means in terms of great power competition in Asia. The Philippines is now more committed than ever to its alliance with the United States. It's also moved closer diplomatically to Australia and Japan. I assume the goal is to deter Chinese aggression?
Yes, there have been several moves to create more alliances between like-minded countries to deter aggression and to deter any moves towards changes to the status quo in the region. That would include the South China Sea and also the Taiwan Strait. The South China Sea has now become one of the world's most volatile flashpoints. And experts who know this region well are worried that in the short term that this particular part of the world could spark some kind of kinetic conflict between China and the US and its allies, or even escalate into a superpower war. And one of the big concerns is that an incident like the death of a Filipino citizen on a Philippine Coast Guard ship could trigger a bigger escalation. The Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, and that means that the United States is bound to respond to any military attack on the Philippines. This is established by the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. But the Cold War era did not really foresee the kinds of coercive gray zone activities that China's carrying out now, and that have been used by Beijing to try and unilaterally change the status quo without resorting to actual lethal force. And so the Biden administration, for its part, hasn't fully spelled out kind of Chinese behavior could invoke a US reaction. So that's an area that we just don't really know how people would react in specific situations yet. Meanwhile, the Philippines is obviously vastly outnumbered by Chinese fleet and navy and its military forces, and so it is taking its own action as well as becoming closer to the United States. It's also tightening its diplomatic and military partnerships with regional allies like Australia and Japan. In May, we saw Australia, the US, and Japan all agreed to step up joint military drills with the Philippines. The Australian Defence Minister, Richard Marles, said that there is power and significance in our four countries acting together, which is, back to your point of deterring Chinese aggression. And Japan and the Philippines also they signed a bilateral defence agreement aimed at enhancing security cooperation and also military drills. And at the same time, Manila has tried through diplomatic means to calm the tensions. Just last month, it signed a provisional agreement with China that would permit the Filipinos to resupply the second Thomas Shoal, which has been another potential flashpoint where the Philippines has a very aging naval ship that is manned by some sailors there, and China's been blocking supplies to that. But that agreement now is there's a real question over whether it's going to hold. Even this week, there was another clash between the Philippine Coast Guard and the Chinese Coast Guard, where two of the Philippine ships were actually damaged.
The Philippines has a close geographical proximity to Taiwan. If China was ever to make a military move on Taiwan, such as a blockade or even an invasion, what would happen in terms of the Philippines?
Again, that's a big question. We don't know all of the answers, but geographically, at its closest point, the Mavulis Island of the Philippines is just 88 miles from the southernmost tip of mainland Taiwan. So the Philippines would most certainly be impacted by an invasion or a blockade. It would be very difficult for it not to be drawn into a conflict, being in such close proximity. The Bashi Channel, which separates the Philippines and Taiwan, is a very strategic passageway. And there's no doubt that the US and its allies, if they were involved in a conflict, which is likely, that they would try to block Chinese access to that passageway, because that would be China's path into the Western Pacific. And so the Philippines would certainly be under pressure to allow its northernmost territory to be used as a staging ground in a conflict. If China was successful in invading Taiwan, it would also have a very strategic location from which to challenge Philippine territorial integrity and even further, and also to expand further into the South China Sea. It would then have access to a Pacific coastline, which it doesn't now, which would allow it to drop submarines more easily into the Pacific, and it would just give it a much bigger strategic advantage to keep moving forward and keep challenging the Philippines over these contested waters and features.
Well, thank you, Nicola, for your very carefully considered responses, which were full of valuable insights. That was Nicola Smith, Asia correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. This podcast is produced by the SOAS China Institute in London, and there's more information about our activities and courses on our website, soas.ac.uk. But for now, that's all from us here on the China in Context podcast team.